Alright, so this is part 2 of making a tent. I've already made my geometry, so I'm going to do here in Substance Painter File, New. I'm using my Unreal 4 template. Next to File, I'm going to click Select, and I'm going to find my wood folder where I have my tent underscore LP and open that up and say OK. So here we go. So you'll notice right away the tent is only one-sided. If I hold Alt and click, polygons are only facing one direction. That's going to be fine. Because we are just working with a plane, it already had default UVs on it. So that's what you're seeing here. Okay, so let's go to Texture Set Settings. I'm going to go to Mesh Maps and click Bake Mesh Maps. And under High Definition Meshes here, click on this icon and select Tent HP and say Open. And I'm just going to hit Bake Default Mesh Maps. Now it's running through and it's baking. You'll do see that I got a little red error here for default material ID. That's because there's no material or anything. I'm not worried about material ID, so I'm just going to ignore that and move on because I'm not worried about that. Okay, so let's hit OK. So now if I hit Alt and click, it's a little bit nicer than it was before. It's looking pretty good. We did leave our aspect ratio square because our tarp more or less is, more square. Let's go to layers and let's just find a texture that we want to put on here, whichever one it might be. Let's try throwing this fabric bamboo. And what if I take this and tile it more? Let's say, all right, 21 is too much. 3. If I tile it at 3, that's a very, oops, I'm going to hold Alt and orbit around. It's a very thick weave on it. Those are big beams though. If I hit F, it'll center it. There we go. Those are definitely big beams, so they can hold up fabric this strong. You just want to make sure it doesn't look weird, like it's made out of some really thick fabric. Now we do have one issue here I'm seeing where when we adjusted our geometry, it adjusted the mesh, but it didn't really space out the UVs better. In the future, what you'll want to do is go back and kind of redo the UVs to compensate for that. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a less noticeable fabric. So let's just throw fabric rough on there. And maybe set that to 3, 4, maybe 6. Yeah, that's all right. Maybe that's what we'll go with, or maybe we'll remove that and put fabric knit. Oh no, that's not at all. I'm going to undo and go back to the other one. Fabric rough aligned. This is good. Let's go ahead and we'll just export this out. File, export texture. We're going to need to define the location, so we should save them all to the same folder that we've been working in up to this point. Select folder and say export. There we go. So now we're done with Substance Painter. Let's close this. You can save the project. I'm just going to discard this. I'm not going to worry about it. So here I am in the wood folder. So there's the tent. I'm going to rename that tent underscore EC. I'm going to go to the normal for it and call it tent underscore N. And the ambient occlusion, I'm going to do tent underscore AORM for ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic. All right, so let's right click on our tent underscore BC, right click on it, and say open with Adobe Photoshop. So Photoshop is going to load up now. I'm going to pause while this is loading. All right, the texture's loaded up inside of Photoshop. And so what I'm going to do inside of here is I'm going to take this background layer. actually I'm just going to click on the new layer button at the very bottom here. There we go, it's a new layer. I'm going to click on the color swatch, and I'm just going to come all the way down here to the bottom and make sure RG and B are black. And say OK. So now if I come up here and switch to a brush, you can also hit B, that would switch to it. And now I'm just going to kind of click along the sides. I'm just going to kind of, I don't want a straight line, I want kind of a rough line kind of going along here. And what I'm doing is I'm making what's called an opacity map. Just dragging along the top. What an opacity map does is anything that's black becomes transparent. And anything that's white is visible. And right now I'm doing like a really quick and dirty one. You could go and get pictures of torn cloth and layer those in if you make them black and white. And that's another way to go through it and make it work. For our purposes, this is going to work just fine. Oops, okay, that kind of went off the rails. Well, if I undo that, there we go. I'm having a hard time with this one. It's just dragging my mouse along there sideways. I'm gonna hit. I'm gonna hold Control and hit the plus on my keyboard, and then hold the space bar to adjust so I can see it. I can see this a little better. Okay. I'll hold Control and minus to zoom out. I'm going to take this background and I'm going to make this foreground. I'm going to come up here to the white and make sure RGB is at 255 and hit OK. And do Edit, Fill with foreground color and say OK. So now everything that's white is going to be visible. Everything that's black is going to be transparent. So now we'll save this file, Save As, and in that same folder for the wood, we're going to call it Tint. But this time we're going to rename it tent_O, and we're actually going to save this as a Photoshop file. So save. And now I'm going to save it one more time, do File, Save As. I'm going to change the type of file to a PNG, and keep that same name, tent_O, and hit Save. All right. So now when I come back to 3ds Max, here's my cloth. If I open my material editor, rendering, material editor, slate material editor, once that opens, I can bring in a new physical material. If I drag in the bitmap, I can go to my location where my wood is, which if you're working on the same machine, you should have a series of folders kind of going always back to the same sort of location. You could pick them up there. Let's drag in one more bitmap. This will be for the opacity, which is right here. Say open. Let's move this over just a little bit. Spacebar to move that over. Okay, so our main cloth, the color, goes into base color map, and our opacity gets plugged into the cutout map. Oops. Now both of those are going to be assigned to the cloth, which I have the model is selected. You can see the name. Right click, assign material to selection, and just make sure show realistic material is on. There we go. Let's minimize that. If I hit F4, you can kind of see it. All right. Sometimes when you have inside a 3ds Max, it's a hard time drawing transparency through itself. If I was to hit render and render out a frame, you can see it renders out visually perfect here. So even though it ends up looking really weird in Max, it's going to show up fine. I'm going to go ahead and just cancel that and then hit cancel here on the renderer. Yeah, Max has a really hard time dealing with transparency. Okay, so let's right click and unhide all, and I'm going to do File, Save. I'm just going to save my tent. It's asking me to overwrite it. I'm going to say, fine, I must have hit Save As. And I'm going to do File, Save As, and I'm going to hit the plus sign so I save a second version. And in here, I'm actually going to delete this cloth underscore HP. There we go. All right, so there's kind of my tent. What I could do at this point is I could actually take the wood. A lot of this cloth has the cloth modifier still. Why don't we right click, select them all, and just convert to edit poly to get rid of them. We can select our dummy and delete that. I can take this beam here, and if I right click and clone it as a copy, I could move it over, and now here in these views kind of rotate it 90 degrees, rotate it down 90 degrees, and I can kind of position it over and just kind of work to get a couple more supports happening here for my tent. Maybe I'll put this at like 50 units. Switch to scale. I'm still on local, so I can just, on the Z here, just scale that in. And then I can right click to clone it again as a copy. Go to move that over to the other side, and I'm just going to rotate him 180 degrees. There we go. And I'll grab this cloth beam in this sort of post that's in the back and right click and clone him as a copy and restore our viewports. And then I'm just going to move, I want to move him so that we got one of these guys in the back as well. Now if we look, there's our tent that we've constructed. I'm just going to get rid of these guys. So there they are. There's our tent. Here's what we're going to do though. I'm going to go into the material editor and I'm going to make a multi-sub-object material. I'm going to plug the wood into ID1 and the cloth I'm going to plug into ID2, and I'm going to select everything in the scene and I'm going to assign that multi-sub-object material to it and change the set number just to 2 and say OK. So now I'm going to take my cloth, right click, or go into the sub-object, go into element, click on the cloth and assign it ID2. Right click and hide that, and then I'm going to go ahead and under create, I'm here in the perspective view. Under create, I'm going to click on box, and I'm going to make a box that is 100 units by 100 units by 100 units and hit create. Right click on the box and say convert to edit poly. Find the edit geometry rollout next to attach is a little setting attach list. Click on that and just select everything in the scene. Oops. I'm holding shift to click on the one on top, say attach. And then go to element, click on the box and delete, and then select everything and just under polygon material IDs assign them all ID1. Now when I right click and unhide all, I can also just click on attach and attach the cloth to the top. So if I hit F4, everything is now all one object. And I could just give this a name, tent. And I can take this model, and what I can do is export this out, put an extra edit poly on it, file, export selected, and I say just tent, and say save. Okay, so later when we start working in a game engine, we can actually bring this asset into it. All right, so that's it. That's how you make a tent. That's how you make the textures for it, get it ready to work as a game asset.